going to show you some actual footage from Australia. Now, none of the footage I'm going to show you from Australia is older than November 25th last year. And the reason that Australia is important is because the area that's been fracked in Australia, which is really northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, has only been fracked for the last 2.5, 3 years. So this is what happens in a relatively short space of time. When we start to look at the US, it's been going on for closer to 2 decades. But the reason Australia is so significant is because this has happened so quickly. Now, the guy that you're going to see in the video is a guy called Brian Monk. Now, 3 years ago, this guy, by his own admission, was your archetypal average Aussie. You know, he was just interested in a chilled life. You know, crack a tube of Foster's, throw a shrimp on the barbie, and he bought 5,000 acres in southern Queensland with a view that he and his son were going to start farming it, and then basically his son was going to manage it, and he was going to just live a life of relaxed luxury. Then the gas industry moved in. Now, Brian has 5,000 acres. There is no gas infrastructure on his property at all. Okay, so there's no rigs, no pads, nothing on his property, but they're all around him. And his property is part of what has been licensed. And in fact, the property is divided between 2 of the gas companies. Now, they don't have to tell him that they're drilling under his property. Because in Australia, in the UK, and in much of the US, the law is based on split estate. This is the legal term, split estate. It's also the name of an excellent documentary that I will reference again a bit later and show you a short clip from. Split estate refers to the fact that the owner of the land owns the surface and just about enough to maybe grow a carrot and a potato. But woe betide you if you find any gold or silver in that top layer, because that's owned by the Crown, and hydrocarbons are owned by the state. So split estate, where you have split estate, the owner, in theory, still controls right of access to the land. But the British government's actually thought about that already, and in the US they thought about that too. But in Australia at the moment, there is still the power to control right of access. But because of the capacity for horizontal drilling, it doesn't mean to say they ain't going to be drilling under your property. So we don't know for sure that the gas companies have drilled under Brian's property. I mean, we can assume they have, but we don't know for sure. But what you're going to see is evidence or the impact of drilling within the vicinity. Now, in the first clip here, Brian and his son, Barry, and his wife are sitting on the veranda around the table. It's a nice day, it's the end of November, it's the end of the dry season, there's a gentle breeze, and there's a gas detector on the middle of the table. The gas detector detects 10 non-indigenous gases. So in a normal environment, the gas detector would be silent. It's picking up 10 non-indigenous gases. Now we can't tell from this particular gas detector what those gases are, but most likely we're talking methane, because that's what's being mined, coal bed methane, from the area.
No comment.
10 gases.
That's unbelievable. That is actually scary. Well, that didn't help, Kathy. You stopped it from clicking.
Well, that's just to say that
we're safe here now, is it?
I've pushed it your way more. There we go. It's come back. It's still in the air. I'm just sort of trying to press fresh air through it.
Well, not from cow farts.
Koala farts.
Not
So
koala
is this
farts.
methane
cow burps.
only?
No.
Oh.
10 gases. No comment.
Is there a list
no
of
comment.
10 gases?
That's unbelievable, that.
In the next clip, Brian and his son have moved about 100 yards away from the house. Like I said, it's the end of the dry season, so the ground is really hard baked. Okay, so just take a look at what happens when they break the surface.
Against it, no reading. We've got a bit of a breeze blowing today. Okay, bring in the workforce. And we've got quite a deflection. I don't know whether the camera can pick that up.
So we can.
So what's happened is that the fracking process has opened up the tight geology, and because the frack fluid is aggressive, that 50% of the frack fluid that's lost down the hole just keeps on going. It just keeps looking for the path of least resistance. And of course it's aggressive, it's got acids in it, it's deliberately designed to eat away at the rock. So it'll just keep on going until it finds, well, the path of least resistance. And eventually either ends up in the water table, or it just sort of percolates through into geology that has a natural porosity, and then the gas will start to migrate to the surface. And of course we're talking an odourless gas. That's why the miners used to take canaries down the pits before the daily safety lamp was invented. When the canary started to get agitated, that was the time to turn and go in the other direction. And if the canary did an impersonation of a Norwegian blue, it's time to hightail it out of there. The next clip is Brian and his son driving down to a well located just outside a community called Tara. They've got the AC, the air conditioning off in the car, so they've just got the vents open and it's just the natural air, the outside air, coming into the vehicle as they drive down. And the gas detector is sitting on the dashboard. You get the picture? So basically they are driving through a contaminated environment. And you can't smell it. Now, in the British media, part of the propaganda that's being put out, this is from the Mail on Sunday on March 24th of this year. Double page spread, how gas gold mine under this pasture could help Osborne end debt nightmare. Well, I'm not going to read you the whole 2 pages of bullshit. Just the first 2 paragraphs. But you'll get the picture. As you approach ground zero of Britain's potential shale gas bonanza and alight next to a 10,000 foot deep hole dug 5 miles east of Blackpool, your nostrils are suddenly assailed by the overwhelming smell of methane. An odourless gas. At first, you think there must be some catastrophic failure of a gas pipe deep below, and you wonder if the fracking revolution really can be the answer to keeping the lights on and Britain's houses warm. But the smell, it turns out, has nothing to do with the drilling of a gas well 2 miles below Lancashire farmland. The villains are cows in the neighbouring field, making their own very distinctive contribution to greenhouse gases. Well, at least the author didn't go to the lengths that the Mail on Sunday went in September of 2009, when they ran a double-page spread making the proposition that Britain's dairy and beef herds should be culled because cow farts were contributing so significantly to global warming. Now, I've got to tell you, sometimes I read these articles and I wonder if the author has their tongue sort of firmly planted in their cheek, because they think that surely people are going to see through this. Surely they'll see I'm being satirical. But of course, the reality is, even if that was the intention, the vast majority of people don't. They read it exactly at face value. And of course, to maintain the propaganda, actually this was the day before, this appeared the day before that article. And this was when we went into that cold snap. Could we face gas rationing? And then the Monday headline was 36 hours away from running out of gas. Of course we weren't. Not a chance in hell. In fact, on the same day that they ran that headline, a guy called Sam Laidlaw, Chief Executive Officer of Centrica, which owns British Gas, was awarded a £4 million bonus. Now the reason he got such a bonus was because, these guys, they may not think like we do. Their primary motivation is this. But at the same time, they're not stupid. And guys like Sam Laidlaw, they have contingency plans on contingency plans on contingency plans on contingency plans. That's what they're paid for. That's what they get the big bucks for. To make sure that the country is never going to be in a situation where it runs out of gas. Not only have we got enormous reserves, primarily under the oceans, in storage. This is gas that's been mined and then it's put into storage in massive salt caverns under the North Sea and also under the Irish Sea. But then we've got pipelines coming in from Norway, from the Netherlands, from Belgium and from France. And by the way, the gas isn't ours anyway. The Treaty of Lisbon makes that very, very clear. We are simply, effectively, the miners of that gas, and we get to use, what it is that we need. But the EU effectively has first dibs on all EU resources. So if there's a problem anywhere else and it's deemed that the UK has to cough up, that's it. That's it. Under the Treaty of Lisbon, we have given away the sovereignty of our national resources. So it's a bit of a misleading presentation in the media anyway. Anyway, back to the videos. Because the other thing is that the gas industry, the shale gas industry says, no, we don't contaminate water. There's no evidence. There's absolutely no evidence of methane migrating into water supplies. And methane's always been in water, which is actually true. It's always been in water, not all water, but some water. It's always been there, in microscopic quantities. And this is why, really, what we need now is we need surveys on water quality and soil quality and air quality, so that we have a baseline, so that if they do start this, and I hope to God they don't, but if they do start this, we've got a baseline. Because otherwise they are simply going to claim that that was there anyway. Well, there's two types of methane anyways. There's the biomethane, which is the stuff that is naturally in the water in relatively microscopic quantities. And then there's the thermomethane, which is basically that which migrates from the gas fields that are fracked, and that's what migrates up through the geology into the water supply. This is from the end of last year, and this is Brian, the same guy we just seen, Brian Monk. This is him running water from his water bore into a vessel, and then he has literally rigged up a device to establish whether or not there is methane content in that water.
Okay, this is our rig up to prove that the government's been lying to us about there being no gas in this water bore. This water bore has now been running for a few minutes, and as you can see, it's burning gas. This would be the gas that the government maintains isn't present, that the Queensland scientists at a couple of laboratories have said there's no gas in this water bore. So every Queenslander can feel quite confident in the fact that the government's tested these gas bores and said that there's no leakage. They can be so confident that they're probably corrupt or lying. Corrupt, lying and incompetent. One or the, it's got to be something. Yep.
We've got BG Group, QGC, on one side of our property and Origin Energy on the other side. Their coal seam gas tenements divide our property in two. We do not have any coal seam gas infrastructure on our property, or so we thought, but this flame is coming from the water from our registered stock and domestic water bore.
I think that is the most damning. It's not a huge amount of gas, but it is so damning because it's there all the time.
Both coal seam gas companies have been heavily extracting water from the aquifers under us, leaving us with very little water and more gas.
That was funny.
It's a good job Brian has a sense of humour, I tell you. Well, after they had been down to the rig at Tara, where they were driving when the gas detector was on the dashboard, when they got home that night, Brian's son, Barry, started to feel very unwell. In fact, he started to slur his words, hadn't been drinking, started to slur his words, and then he basically lost all coherence. Anyway, then he managed to sort of say he was going to go to bed, and as he got up, his leg buckled from under him. So they called an ambulance, and he was taken to hospital, and he was kept in hospital, under observation for a few days. And then they dismissed him from hospital, they released him from hospital, claiming it was calcium deficiency. Calcium deficiency. Methane is a neuroinhibitor. So one of the symptoms of getting methane into the body, obviously if you get it in excessive quantities, you're going to be asphyxiated because it's going to force the oxygen out. But if you're taking it in relatively small quantities on a consistent basis, then, like all things, not everyone is susceptible in the same way. But there's little doubt that Barry's symptoms were related to an overdose, effectively, of methane. Methane has the neuroinhibitors. It also contains DNA disruptors and endocrine disruptors. In the film Split Estate, which is a documentary that was released in 2009, I'm sure some of you have heard of the film Gasland. Yeah? Okay, well, Gasland is a good documentary. And it was made by a young man by the name of Josh Fox, who had an interesting plot of land, a beautiful parcel of land, actually, in Pennsylvania, over here. And he was offered, in 2008, he was offered $100,000 by a gas company for open access onto his property. Well, at the time, he really wasn't that familiar with the gas industry, but he realised that you don't get offered $100,000 for nothing. So being a smart guy, he decided that he would take a road trip and start to investigate what had occurred in the gas lands over here in Colorado and in New Mexico and in Texas and here in Oklahoma. And what he saw absolutely shocked him. So he made the documentary Gasland. Well, Split Estate actually predates Gasland. Of course, the Split Estate doesn't roll off the tongue like Gasland does. So Gasland is the documentary that sort of got into the, if you like, the popular consciousness. But Split Estate predates Gasland, and in my opinion is a better documentary. And it focuses on the communities in this area here, western Colorado and northwestern New Mexico. And particularly on a community up here, it's the community of a town called Rifle, who have had the gas rigs in their area for close on 20 years. And what you will see is, of course, people naturally want, especially if they were born and raised in an area. I mean, in the US, you know, you've got something like 75% of people who live in many of these states have never been outside their states. You know, I think there's only 19% of Americans who have passports. But, you know, many of them never go outside their state because, I mean, when you take into account, I say that this is twice the size of England. You know, they've got everything they need. So these people, and many of them live on land that, you know, was first farmed by their descendants who came over on the wagon trains. And so they have an existential attachment to that property. And so they don't want to leave it, despite the fact that basically it's just becoming more and more uninhabitable. And because the gas industry doesn't have to report any contamination, if the gas industry learns that somebody has had their water supply contaminated, then they will come along and put a big buffalo tank outside the property. Not because they've admitted any liability, they're just being neighbourly. But woe betide anybody who kicks up about the quality of their water, because if they do, and they start pointing the finger at the gas company, then they're going to find the buffalo tank disappears. And then, of course, they're once again reliant on, you know, the well-bore water. And what you would see if you watch the film Split Estate, and it is up on YouTube at the moment, it goes up and down, it's on a German website at the moment. So you see Split Estate and you see the German text alongside, but the film, of course, is in English. And in that documentary, you will see that there's a particular family that are focused on, and the husband doesn't appear to have suffered, you know, unduly, but the wife has gone into early dementia. And of course the oil industry says, oh, it has nothing to do with us, it's just one of those things, these things happen. But there's a lady called Dr. Theo Colborn, who's regarded as one of the world's leading specialists on endocrine disruption, and she's certainly of the opinion that this is the type of symptom that you can expect to see on an increasing basis of people who are exposed to contaminated water. And of course, it's not just drinking it, you're washing in it. You're washing your clothes in it, you're washing your crockery and your cutlery in it. So, you know, the toxicity may not appear to be excessive, it's not going to make you sick, it's not like, you don't have to mix it with orange juice and hold your nose. But it's just chipping away. You know, in fact, it's far more pernicious because, you know, over a period of a decade or 2 decades, that's when it's really going to start to bite. So let's just have a look at this, a short clip from the documentary Split Estate. Now, what you're going to see is you're going to see a representative of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. And of course, the people in the Oil and Gas Association, they're effectively the community representatives, but they wouldn't be doing those jobs if they weren't apologists for the gas industry. And you're going to see one particular Stepford wife, and listen to how she easily dismisses, you know, the fracking process and justifies the fact that the gas companies do not have to declare the recipe for the frack fluid. This is part of the problem, that there is no transparency whatsoever in what is being pumped down hole.
We have a very large emphasis with our 325 member companies about being a good neighbor, about talking to people, about doing the things that you would do in your neighborhood with your next door neighbor.
When they were doing this pump jack, I wasn't home at the time. And anyway, they brought in this huge rig to put that machine on there. They had already agreed several years before to fence off the old cemetery. My great-grandfather is buried here, and his son, Filomeno Armenta, who probably died about 1914. When I came down, I saw the porta potty. The porta potty was, I said, well, they kind of put the porta potties a little bit too close. And there was a huge pile of gravel right on top of the cemetery. First thing, when we saw it, we were in shock. The markers were sandstone, and one of the markers was an old cedar post. And I haven't been able to locate the cedar post or what the heck they did with it. I don't know if they hauled it off as trash. They totally wiped out the cemetery. At my own expense, I came in and I put this pipe fence to make sure they don't do it again. When I put this fence up, they sent me a letter telling me they're going to sue me. They wanted me to furnish proof that it was there. They have reneged on protecting the cemetery as they promised. And now I don't know where none of the markers are.
In the U.S. and the lower 48 onshore, the boom that is currently going on is driven a lot by technology. There have been a lot of technological advances with horizontal drilling, with fracture stimulation.
One of the key elements to finding and getting the resource out of very tight sand or hard rock is a fracking process. Fracking is just a short word for fracturing.
Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's commonly called, is a drilling technique first commercialized by Halliburton in 1949.
It comes in with very high-powered water and sand and a slightly soapy mixture. And all it does is it goes down and it just fractures little tiny fractures in the rock. And then the sand goes into those fractures and allows the gas to escape. And then the gas flows in to the pipe and up to the surface and to people's homes.
Hydraulic fracturing is largely responsible for the domestic drilling boom. Because of its high cost, it was not widely used until recently, in the 1990s, when the price of natural gas shot up high enough to make it affordable.
And really what was not economical over the last 50 years or so is now economic, and it should continue, particularly if prices stay where they are.
Here are the reserve pits here.
Dr. Theo Colborn is one of the world's leading authorities on endocrine-disrupting chemicals in the environment and their impact on humans.
Down in here, the trucks are coming all the way from Delta, which is 30 miles to here, but we're looking
She has been studying the chemicals used by the industry for drilling and extraction and documenting their effects.
Basically, our first list of the chemicals that were being used was this very, very short and uninteresting list that EPA put together. It certainly wasn't comprehensive, we knew. We found out very rapidly that it was no small list. They don't tell you everything that's in a product. You may only get 5% of what's in that product. And the rest of it is proprietary, or they just don't give it. They don't have to.
It's water and it's sand and it's a surfactant, in other words. But it is also proprietary because every single fracking company, whether it's a Schlumberger or it's a BJ Services or it's a Halliburton, they sell that theirs is the best product. And so it's proprietary. It would be like divulging, why your chocolate is better than somebody else's chocolate because you have those ingredients.
Oil and gas deposits below ground contain toxic compounds that are brought to the surface during drilling. These compounds pollute the environment and can cause health problems. But the impacts of drilling are made even worse by the chemical products that are injected during the process. Dr. Colborn has documented over 200 products used in Colorado drilling. Over 90% contain chemicals with adverse health effects.
yet you can't get the specific information. I mean, you know, she really has to play the role of the detective in trying to ascertain, you know, what's in the fluid, let alone in what quantities. You know, so you know that when they're not prepared, when any company is not prepared to be transparent like this, you know they've got something to hide. And it goes way beyond being proprietary, you know, because there are ways and means that you could set up, you know, third-party oversight to protect the proprietary information, but they're just not prepared to work with that at all. And in this country, you know, we're talking about the companies that want to start this fracking process being responsible. You know, forgive me if I have zero confidence in that, especially with Lord John Brown at the helm. You know, profit before all else. And you heard the guy from ConocoPhillips. You know, provided prices stay high, we should basically keep on drilling and fracking. Not throughout the film, there is no mention, you know, these guys of any concern about the environmental or health impacts. And of course, because of the nature of the areas, these are very, very thinly populated. And so the impact on the population there is considered acceptable collateral. Now, you know, we need to understand as well that in this country, we've practiced acceptable collateral. In the coal mining industry in this country, between 1850 and 1996, a period of 146 years, some 200,000 people in the mining industry were killed. That's an average of 1,500 a year for 146 years. Top of the league table, by the way, is Lancashire. Second was South Wales. I thought Yorkshire might be right up there, but it appears that's not the case. It's about fourth, I think. But that doesn't include, of course, the deaths due to pneumoconiosis or any of the other respiratory diseases or asthma or whatever that you know, resulted on people living in these environments or downwind of these environments. That 1,500 a year, nearly 200,000 over 146 years, is literally the result of absolute accident involved in the mining industry. That's acceptable collateral. You know, it's also only 170 years since the age at which a child could be made to work down the pit was raised from 6 to 10. You know, so we have come, I'd like to think, you know, we've come some way in the past 170 odd years. But now, what's happening here is we're looking at a potential situation where large tranches of the population are not going to get any choice in it. Because we're entering into an era, shale gas extraction, which is pure Russian roulette. Because the geologists, the petroleum engineers and the chemists have no clue. They will claim they do, of course, but it's no more than an educated guess based on past experience. But that's all it is. It's an educated guess as to how much geology is actually going to be fractured. And where that fluid is going to migrate to. And then where the methane gas that they're trying to mine is also going to migrate to. And the first time you notice it is probably when you go down to a river or a stream, because you see the bubbling. In Brian's Ranch in Queensland, in southern Queensland right now, it's the rainy season, it's the end of the wet season now. But when I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, he said, Ian, he said, it's unbelievable. He said, of course my ground's waterlogged, but it's just a sea of bubbles. You can't, obviously when the ground was hard baked, at least that was some protection against the gas migrating out of the soil. But now that, you know, obviously the ground is a sea of mud and it's covered in water, you just see the bubbles coming through. And of course you heard him say in the film that the environmental agencies and the water authorities say you haven't got a problem. Total denial. This is the area in the US that is now the focus. This is Pennsylvania, which is right in the heart here, right in the heart of the Marcellus Shale. And Pennsylvania, basically the state of Pennsylvania has just said, let's go for it. Let's just frack the crap out of the state. Now, one of the problems with Pennsylvania is that the Appalachian Mountains here, which run up here, the Appalachian Mountains form what's called a triple divide. In other words, the water runoff from this area goes in three directions. It goes to the Great Lakes, it goes to the Atlantic Ocean, and it goes down to the Gulf of Mexico via the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And New York has put a moratorium on fracking, but the people and the state of New York is increasingly concerned because much of its water comes from Pennsylvania. And that's really, the sort of issue that we're going to face here, because Lancashire, Quadrilla are looking at 72 pads, and that's just in the first phase. David Cameron is already talking about 800 wells in the first phase of shale gas drilling in this country. So Lancashire, that's the water from the Lake District, which feeds into Manchester at the moment. But Pennsylvania is just a little bit under the size of England. It's at 95% of the size of England. But the population is less than a quarter that of England. And most of the population is actually centred on the two key cities of Pennsylvania, which is Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Now, the rest of the territory is very, very thinly populated. In fact, the average population density in here is about the same as we have in places like the Peak District, the North York Moors, the Lake District, even Dartmoor. Yet, of course, by US standards, this is a densely populated state. Not as densely populated as Massachusetts or New York, but certainly, it's up there in the northeast. But the issue really is they might be ready to frack the land, but it's the impact that it's going to have on other states that is the greater concern. Now, the opposition. The industry knows that it's going to meet with opposition, whether it's the traditional opposition groups, the environmentalists, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, or independents. Now, at the moment, they're trying to dismiss, and I'll show you an article that appeared in The Sun last year. They're trying to dismiss anybody who dares to challenge the dash for gas as an eco-mentalist or as a communist or a socialist. Any term they can come up with that will marginalise them. But you know that they know they're in for a run when Quadrilla have just brought in a guy from Betfair who used to work with Microsoft to focus on PR. The guy knows nothing at all about the oil and gas industry. His background is Microsoft and Betfair. I mean, his forte is obviously lobbying at government level. But the fact that they're paying this guy, I can guarantee you this guy is probably on at least £250,000. So you know that they know they're in for a run here. But if I haven't got your attention, with the prospect of water contamination, soil contamination, and air contamination, this might get your attention, has in some areas. This was an article that appeared in The Observer last June. Worry for homeowners who face the threat of fracking. It says property prices in some areas are being threatened by fracking. Well, that was actually based on an article that had been, or a report that had been commissioned by the financial website, This Is Money. And in that report it said shale gas could redraw the economic map of Britain, but prices of houses near wells could fall by 24%. Well, let me tell you the reality. When the gas industry moves in, property prices crash. This is the case in Blackpool right now. Since the second earthquake, the property market in Blackpool has totally tanked. Now, I have first-hand experience of this because some very good friends of mine who I've spoken in Blackpool probably twice a year for the last 8 years, and every time I speak in Blackpool I always stayed with them. But after the second earthquake in May of 2011, they decided it was time to accelerate their retirement plan, which basically was to leave the area and to move to Spain. So they found an apartment in Spain, moved to Spain, but they obviously still needed to sell their house in the UK. So they contacted estate agents. 3 estate agents came around and looked at the property, this beautiful 5-bedroom house in Porton-le-Fylde, which once upon a time was a very desirable suburb of Blackpool. The estate agents all valued the property at £325,000. But my friend said, you know what, we'd really like to sell it very quickly, so we're going to put it on the market at £250,000. And the estate agents said, but you'll upset the market. And they said, well, not for long, because hopefully someone's going to realise that it's a real bargain and snap it up. Well, so the property's been on the market for almost 2 years. Do you know how many offers they've had on that property? A big fat 0. Well, we were actually talking about the problem of the housing market in Blackpool when I was visiting with them in Spain in the middle of March. And while I was there, they got a phone call from the agent, and they were really excited because they thought, oh, maybe we've got an offer. Well, they didn't have an offer. They had somebody who was interested in the house, and they would have bought it, but it's a couple who are both single parents. They both got 2 kids, and they both have 3-bedroom houses, and they want to move in together. But they can't, because they can't move 4 kids into a 3-bedroom house. So they were interested in my friend's house, but they can't buy it because they can't sell their houses. Anyway, they had managed to rent one of their properties, and so they asked the agent if my friend might be prepared to consider renting the 5-bedroom property on the basis that when they sell at least one of their houses, they could then maybe be in a position to buy it. Well, let me tell you, if they sell one of their houses and they come up with an offer, even probably close to 200,000, my friend will probably bite their arm off, because it's a liability. It's not an asset right now; it's a liability. Okay, at least they've got somebody living in it, which is at least keeping it in reasonable shape. But I came back from that trip to Spain, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a little bit of research myself. So I called around some of the Blackpool estate agents, and well, you got to remember they're estate agents. So of course they told me it was a buyer's market, and that right now I could have the pick and choose of almost any property I wanted in Blackpool, especially if I was a cash buyer. Anyway, there was one estate agent in particular who I spoke to who was actually familiar with my work, and he said, Ian, he said, absolutely right. He said, it is a big issue, it's a very concerning issue. He said, and actually, since the moratorium has been lifted, a lot of property has come onto the market, but most of it will probably never sell unless a ban is introduced. And he said, even then, I think people are nervous that it might be lifted, and so in all probability, the Blackpool area housing market is not going to be in good shape for at least a decade. Well, that's exactly the same elsewhere. This is North Texas. This is a family called the Ruggierios. This is in the gasfield just to the northwest of Dallas. Beautiful part of the States, the hill country there. And here it is. This is from the article. The Ruggierios purchased their home in 2004 and watched a gas and oil company set up wells 300 feet from their back door in September 2009. So 1 year later, the $250,000 property that they put $50,000 worth of work into had been valued at $75,000. The reality is that the only people who would probably offer them $75,000 is a gas company for open access onto their land. This is what they have to deal with. This is the Ruggierios. This is the view from their kitchen window. This is the view from their back garden. Here's the house, here's the well. In Colorado, they are now placing wells directly alongside schools. They are coming, in Split Estate, you will see that they're actually starting to move into communities. And I published an article in my newsletter a few weeks ago showing how the gas companies are now just not giving a damn, and they're coming right into the heart of communities to access the shale. Remember, the horizontal drilling, because it's tight geology, you can only horizontally drill for a few hundred yards. You can't drill for miles. In the south of England, we have a rig in the New Forest. It's been there for 23 years. And that drilled 8 miles out into the offshore field, because the local authorities of Bournemouth and Poole didn't want a rig on the horizon. So they agreed with the oil company to put the rig inside the New Forest and then drill out under the sea. But that's drilling through porous geology. And this stuff you can only drill a few hundred yards. That's why they're coming right into the towns. To show you what it looks like, because they need 6 to 8 vertical wells per square mile to maximise the shale. This is what it looks like in southern Queensland. This is about a square kilometre. Now here they've got no real issue because they've got relatively open access. Each well requires about 400 truck journeys. Tankers, plus the rig, plus pumps. When you run the frack, you're going to have anything from a dozen to 2 dozen frack pumps. And by the way, when they fire up, and you'll know, especially if you're downwind. So we don't have the infrastructure in this country to deal with this. All the motorways are going to end up looking like the A14, the road from Felixstowe, which is one lane, it's a convoy of containers. We just don't have the infrastructure for this. And the other issue that isn't being discussed yet is the health impact. I mean, we've got a National Health Service that's dying on its feet, and yet this is undoubtedly going to put a burden on the health service. Even though, of course, the oil industry and the government are going to deny that the increase in negative health has anything at all to do with their activities.
And it's going to be fully privatised in 5 years.
Well, so the bottom line is the vast majority of people won't be able to afford the healthcare. So it's part of the culling process. I think we're starting to see that. In Australia, this may look impressive, but because the areas where they're fracking are so thinly populated, these people have often come from literally hundreds of miles to participate in the protest. I mean, it's under the umbrella of Lock the Gate. But, I mean, they're having some impact in some areas, but, in the scheme of things, unfortunately, they are little more than a mosquito on the back of an elephant. It's a lot easier to stop the process from ever starting than it is to stop it once it's started. But we have a very, very narrow window of opportunity. But the problem is that the government, the British government in particular, already realises that they're going to be up against some opposition. So at the back end of last year, they initiated a bill called the Growth and Infrastructure Bill. This bill went through Parliament in record time, 55 days. The reason it went through in record time was because MPs had been told that this was the bill that was going to remove the bureaucracy and red tape from small businesses. In this current economic climate, we need people to develop entrepreneurial skills. And this is going to take away, all the obstacles that are in place. And of course the MPs went, yeah, okay, I'll vote for that. It rushes through Parliament. It goes to the House of Lords. And when it's being debated in the Lords, there is some realisation that this is actually a little bit more than just a bill that removes red tape from entrepreneurs and small businesses. And the Telegraph, to their credit, actually published this article in February, fears that fracking could be fast-tracked. The Growth and Infrastructure Bill actually creates an opportunity for the British government to decree that something is so significant for the well-being of the UK economy or for our national energy security, even though we can't claim sovereignty of it because it's controlled by the EU, they can simply overrule any local opposition. So, one of the things here is in trying to flag up to local councillors that they've been taken out of the equation. Earlier this year, Quadrilla in the Fylde Peninsula announced that they wouldn't be doing any drilling or fracking in 2013. And some local activists went, yeah, we've got them on the run. And in South Wales and in the Mendips in Somerset, UK Methane announced that they were withdrawing all of the planning applications that they had submitted to the local authorities to place their pads. That's what you saw on that picture from South Queensland. And the activists in Somerset went, yeah, we got them on the run. Sorry, ain't that simple. The reason that Quadrilla have announced that they're not going to drill this year, the reason that UK Methane have announced that they're pulling their planning applications, is because they are waiting for the Growth and Infrastructure Bill to be put on the statute books. It's now got royal assent, by the way, but to be placed on the statute books so that Osborne and Cameron can effectively give these guys the green light. And no amount of local opposition will be taken into account. And at that point, what are you left with? Well, you're left with the situation that they have in Australia, which is basically direct action. Trying to blockade the infrastructure from coming onto the pad. Well, let me show you what happened in Australia, because in Ireland, Shell have been called out, paying the Irish Gardaí, the police, directly to protect the Shell infrastructure in North West Ireland, in the Rossport facility, against the local community. In Australia, basically they're doing the same. I mean, just like the miners' strike, you know, where it was the Metropolitan Police that were put into Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, so that you never had police from the local community, you never had anybody in the local community who might have empathy with the strikers. Well, they're doing the same in Australia. They bring in the police from the cities, who have no empathy with the people who live in the country. So let me show you what happened here. This was an attempt at a blockade. In the immediate period prior to this shot being taken, a woman had been seriously injured. She'd been knocked over by one of the trucks going onto the pad. An ambulance has been called.
Yeah, Kate, you got permission to go up there, hasn't she? She's a photographer. I want to close the door. Good. Kate's got permission, yeah? Yeah. Photographer. That's
everything you look! Disgusting, isn't it? Freaking disgusting! Yes, shut up! Shut up!
You get the picture. I mean, this is the way the corporatocracy works. It is the priority to get the corporations wherever it is that they feel they need to be. The reality is that we don't even need the hydrocarbons in this quantity. In fact, we've never needed the hydrocarbons in this quantity. Has anyone got any idea when it was that Henry Ford was instructed to stop building the electric car? It was 1896. 1896. He was instructed to stop building the electric cars by a guy called John D. Rockefeller.
To build one with their own oil.
Owner of Standard Oil. Had to?
They built one with their own oil.
Oh, that was 1946. And he was told to shut that down too. The reason that the electric cars were popular amongst the wealthy in the late 19th century was because they were clean, they were quiet, and they required very little maintenance. You plugged them in at night, there was an infrastructure in the city of New York and other cities where you could drive them in from the short commute. I mean, they weren't the cities that we know today. Plug them in the streets and then drive home. Well, once John D. Rockefeller had got the electric car production line shut down, and by the way, 2/3 of Ford's production in the late 1890s was electric vehicles. In fact, that was pretty much mirrored in New York. There were 2,500 vehicles registered, 1,800 of them were electric. Once John D. Rockefeller got the electric production line shut down, he was also he was buying up and shutting down the electric tramways that had been built in many of the cities around the US, and then replacing them with buses. The argument being the buses were more flexible with regard to the changing demographics. But then as the personal vehicle became more affordable, the buses were wound down so that people had the incentive to have their own personal vehicle, which of course meant that because it was an internal combustion engine, that John D. Rockefeller had created his unending revenue stream. And then with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913 in the US, then that was the first time, by the way, income tax was introduced in the US. But of course, as the government started to finance their projects through borrowing from private bankers, they had to repay the loan and the interest on those loans, so they needed taxation revenues. And even today, the most effective way of fleecing people of their disposable income after income tax is through taxes on hydrocarbons. That's why when we fill up at the pump, we're paying, what, 133, give or take? About 133 for a litre of fuel, yet over 80 pence worth of that is tax. And of course we have a mobility tax. I mean, if you want to get around, you need fuel, and therefore you're paying a tax. The other part of the cabal that controls this is the engine efficiency. So doesn't it strike anybody sort of really quite strange that the average engine efficiency is exactly the same today as it was 70 odd years ago? The average vehicle returns 35 miles a gallon. Obviously some do more, some do less. The average is 35 miles a gallon. It's very carefully calculated, because they've calculated how much fuel they want to sell and how much taxation revenue they want to get. If you start to mess with your engine, you can be charged with tax evasion. It's like if a farmer uses red diesel, i.e. agricultural diesel, on a vehicle he drives on the road, it's tax evasion. There was a guy who came to one of my workshops last year. He was in his 70s. And at the end of the day, he said, "Ian, come outside, I want to show you something." And he opened the bonnet of his 1992 Mercedes. And it's running on a water fuel cell. And he told me it's been running on a water fuel cell since 1993. And I said, "Well, that's amazing." I said, "How come nobody knows about this?" He said, "Because in 1994, he said, I spent 8 months in jail for tax evasion. And when I came out of jail, they told me that I could drive my vehicle with the water fuel cell, but if I told anybody about it, I'd be back in jail for tax evasion." Every vehicle is a revenue collection device. And that's why any alternatives are suppressed. It's a myth that there is any real interest by the hydrocarbon companies or the governments to find viable alternatives. The only way in which they will permit a viable alternative to effectively come into the mainstream is provided there is a way to tax it as efficiently as hydrocarbons. So what they do is they allow 8% of the total market over to alternatives, because one of the reasons that the hydrocarbon industry wants to know about alternatives is so they can shut them down, normally through buying up the patents. And if the person won't sell the patent, then they deal with them in another way. This from the 1990s.
Okay, it never wears out because there's no moving parts.
In the top, our news here at 6 o'clock, an age-old dream becoming a reality. A local inventor has discovered a way, hear this, to use water to run your car.
It's a major breakthrough that will no doubt make motorists happy. And as Ralph Robinson explained, the Pentagon is also showing lots of interest in this project.
Water has always been considered a precious commodity, but Stan Meyer's invention may make it even more valuable. He has developed what's called a water fuel cell. It has taken the place of his old gas tank. The water fuel cell breaks down water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. The hydrogen is used to run his dune buggy.
I don't care if you use rainwater, well water, city water, ocean water. If you don't have any fresh water, go ahead and use snow. If you don't have any snow available to you, then use salt water because there's no adverse effect to the fuel cell.
Meyer started working on this project 4 years ago. He's not a scientist. He isn't even a chemist. In fact, he never graduated from college. Myers was determined, he says, to design something to protect this country from oil embargoes.
And we have calculated that if we take the dune buggy from Los Angeles to New York, we would roughly use 22 gallons of water.
The Pentagon flew a lieutenant colonel in last week to look at Meyer's invention. There's talk of possibly using it in the Star Wars defense program and to run army tanks. Myers is currently perfecting a water fuel cell for cars. It will cost about $1,500. He says it won't need any maintenance and you won't have to replace it. It'll be at least 2 years before the fuel system goes into mass production. The day it happens will be one the fuel industry hates, but it'll put a smile on the face of those who've had to say at one time or another, fill her up.
You heard what the commentator said. It'll be at least 2 years before the water cell goes into production, and that'll be a day the oil industry hates. Well, that'll be a day the oil industry makes sure doesn't happen. In fact, Stan Myers, he turned down a multi-billion-dollar offer because he wasn't interested. I mean, he was wealthy, he was an inventor. He wasn't interested in signing the invention over to the corporatocracy. He wanted to develop it himself. They made sure that it wasn't going anywhere. So, when you're talking about the issue of fracking, with whoever it is you can address it with, I mean, some people are talking to their MPs, some people are talking to their local councillors, their district councillors, or even just share it around, because we've got to get this like poll tax. It's got to get into the mass consciousness. There's not a lot of point in telling them that, you know, we don't need oil, because they're just going to dismiss you as a rampant conspiracy theorist. So we've got to give a viable alternative. So, you know, we are unfortunately and tragically locked into a hydrocarbon economy. Whatever anybody else says with alternatives like wind power and sea power, yeah, they're all viable potentially, but the reality is that the hydrocarbon industry dominates the corporatocracy. And governments are quite happy to maintain that domination because of the tax revenues they get from it. So we've got to offer viable alternatives. You know, some of the activists are basically, I mean, they call themselves extreme energy activists. And there's no question. I mean, they don't, I think, really help themselves by basically saying we want to shut this down, shut that down, we don't want to do any drilling. Yeah, I mean, that would be the ideal world. We don't need to, period. But, you know, it's baby steps. In the first instance, the critical issue is shutting down the drilling and fracking process on land in this country. If we don't do this, in 10, 15, 20 years, we're not going to recognise this country. You know, the soil is going to be poisoned, we're not going to be able to grow crops, we're not going to be able to raise livestock, you know, we're going to be dependent on the corporations for our drinking water. And if you haven't seen Jesse Ventura's expose of the water scandals in the US, where the water is being taken out of the Great Lakes, shipped to China, and then coming back as bottled water containing fluoride of lithium. I mean, you know, Jesse Ventura comes out with some interesting stuff. Yeah, and most of what he presents is corroborated, easily corroborated. It cannot be dismissed as rampant conspiracy, although the media will try, of course. But, you know, check that out. So imagine a situation where, you know, in a few years' time, we are totally reliant on the corporations for the water. And we should take that seriously, because last year, the chief executive officer of Nestle, a guy called Peter Brabeck, recorded an interview where he stated that water should not be considered a human right. That access to water should be controlled by the corporations. In other words, unless you're a willing corporate slave, then you deny yourself the right to access water. Well, where these guys are ultimately going is they're going to do the same with air. You know, because the air is going to become toxic. So, you know, imagine a situation, we're probably not too far away from it, where houses are hermetically sealed, and to get breathable air, clean air, you pay for it. It's another utility. Otherwise, you're just out there taking your chances. These socio-psychopathic global corporatists have a game plan. It's called Agenda 21. It's been their policy and philosophy since the Earth Conference in Rio in 1992. It was adopted by the UN almost immediately afterwards. And in Agenda 21, it specifically calls for the move towards moving people away from the land into controlled environments, i.e. the cities. And if you see the map of the western states of the US and how much land in the western states the federal government has purchased, primarily so that they can use it obviously for the gas drilling, and they don't have to worry about owners not letting them on the land because they own the land. And what they're going to be left with is, you know, wasteland and cities, the controlled environments. So, you know, we've got to wake up to a reality, which is that within a generation, 2 at the outside, if we allow this to kick off, you know, we really are contributing to creating a future for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations that actually doesn't even bear thinking about. And I believe these guys know it. They know exactly what they're doing. That's why they obfuscate, that's why they lie, that's why they deceive, that's why they refuse to be transparent in any way, shape or form. You know, we're sold the meager benefits. This is what we're told are the benefits. Cheap gas. Well, that one got blown out of the water a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, when the cross-party group that were commissioned to look at the potential for cheap gas from drilling for shale gas and coal bed methane in this country, and they basically said it's not likely to happen. Well, of course it's not likely to happen. When did you ever know prices to go down? You know, they're just going to reap the corporate benefits. The balance of trade. I don't think so. You know, our borrowing is increasing. When the current pair of clowns took office, our borrowing was 82% of GDP. Now it's at 86% of GDP, and it's forecast to be at 100% of GDP by 2018. Once the borrowing reaches 100% of GDP, you're owned by the banks. Like Ireland, like Greece, like Spain, like Portugal, Italy, soon France, and the UK. So we may be slowing it down a little bit, but it ain't going away. So that's not going to happen. The energy security, well, we already explained, we don't have any energy security. That's all taken care of by the Treaty of Lisbon. And here's the UK government's version of behavioural adjustment payments. This is from the Daily Telegraph just last week. The government to offer cheaper energy bills to communities that don't oppose fracking. Yeah, and community briberies. I mean, like, you know, you need a new play park, you need a new community centre. Yeah, they'll throw money at these communities because they know They know that this is the only way in which they can get them to ignore the risks and the perils associated with the industry being in their backyard. You know, 2 weekends ago I visited with a guy in Blackpool who is absolutely of the opinion that the damage to his house was caused by the second earthquake. And he showed me all the cracks in the house, around the door frames. He said these weren't there before May 2011. So not only has his house got no value, the insurance company won't touch it because it was an earthquake, act of God. Despite the fact that Quadrilla have actually acknowledged that the seismic events were most probably related to their fracking. But he can't get the repairs done on the house because the insurance companies say it was an act of God. Anyway, then he gets a letter through the post saying, well, we're not insuring your house anyway anymore. So this is the other problem. No one can insure their property. So this is the downside. The water contamination, the soil contamination, the air contamination, the water shortages. You know, this is a country that goes from feast to famine in water in a heartbeat. You know, and where are we going to get these millions of gallons of water that are needed for 800 wells that David Cameron's talking about? Seismic events. The property prices crash wherever you look around the world. Same in US, Canada, Australia, Blackpool. It's not going to be any different anywhere else. No buildings insurance and large areas of the UK potentially uninhabitable. You know, I told you earlier that I'd show you the crass attempt to dismiss those who oppose the agenda. This is from Jeremy Clarkson's column in The Sun. I don't believe for 1 minute that Clarkson wrote this, because this appeared in Clarkson's column the day after the government had lifted the moratorium. So somebody had penned this, and they literally probably paid Clarkson to put his name to it. You know, it's written in Clarkson-esque satire. But the purpose is to demonise those who oppose the dash for gas. I mean, I won't bore you with all the details, but, you know, he calls those who oppose eco-mentalists, hippies that can't afford to do anything because they spend all day up a tree looking at squirrels and humming. They are socialists, they want communism. You know, this is the crass dismissals. One of the things that he might be right on is he says, Swampy and his mates say that if we frack under Lancashire, Blackpool Tower will fall into the sea and Preston will cease to exist. Well, you know what? Blackpool Tower was strengthened under the collar immediately after the second earthquake, and that strengthening is still in place there right now. Well, pure coincidence, of course. And as for Preston being uninhabitable, it's a possibility. It's an absolute distinct possibility.
By an attractive lady as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. You know, she has nothing to do with the article. She was due to another article, but there she is. And then, you know, we have, this is actually a graphic that was used by BIF, the Britain and Ireland Frack Free. This is the outrageous article. I mean, this was an unbelievable article that Peter Lilly penned in the Telegraph last week. And, I mean, it is institutional denial. It is willful ignorance. Again, trying to dismiss anybody who has the audacity to challenge official orthodoxy. That's what we're up against. So, you know, I'm not interested really in trying to get this into the mainstream media. In fact, every time I have been invited to participate in anything by the BBC or the other mainstream channels, I've always said thanks but no thanks, because anything that's recorded, not a chance. Not a chance. I will only do live stuff. So the mainstream media are not the route. So the method that I'm trying to, if you like, undermine their dash for gas is by holding these events, regardless of how many people, holding these events all around the country. I'm trying to sow the seeds. You know, hopefully you guys will go away and take a look at this stuff for yourself. If you do nothing else, you know, look at Split Estate. This documentary that I've mentioned. Look at Gasland. Look at the documentary put out by the pro-frackers, which is called Frack Nation, which is produced by an Irishman called Phelim McAleer. But, you know, look at both sides of the coin. Like, decide for yourself. You know, I've shown you the footage from Brian Monk in Australia, because for me that is the most damning footage that you can see from an area. I haven't picked and choose from around the world. That's one guy's farm. And I've showed you prima facie evidence of the contamination of the soil, the contamination of the air, and the contamination of the water. So what makes the UK so special that it ain't going to happen here? Nothing. Nothing. So we've got a hell of an uphill battle, but I genuinely believe, I absolutely and genuinely believe that we can stop this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be wasting my time doing over 1,000 miles a week, 5 presentations every night of the week, all around the country, and doing that for nearly 13 weeks. I do believe that we can bring about the change. It starts with everyone obviously trying to educate themselves and then sharing this information and trying to educate others. And if you get the opportunity to spread the word, then get people down to Novotel in Sheffield city centre tomorrow. But there's always something that comes out of left field. And back in 2009, I recorded a presentation called The Green Agenda and Population Reduction. And in that presentation, I made the observation, I said, we are literally a few weeks away from seeing the first stages of global governance being foisted upon us. Because I'd read the scripts for the forthcoming Copenhagen meeting in December 2009. I knew exactly what the game plan was. The game plan was to initiate a global carbon trading process, all based on the global or climate change agenda. And in that presentation I said, barring something coming completely out of the blue, completely out of left field, then by January we are going to have the first stages of global governance in place. Literally a week after I recorded that presentation, the ClimateGate emails released. Now, a few people have read them, but there is a wonderful document on the web. It's written by a guy called Dr. John P. Costello. It's a document that he first published in January 2010. It's called the ClimateGate emails. And you don't even need to get beyond the first 20 pages to appreciate the magnitude of the lies and the deception perpetrated by the climate scientists, all in the interest of maintaining their grants. And how they were literally manipulating data, how they were manipulating who was or wasn't involved in the peer review process, and so on and so forth. So consequently, those people who did make a little bit of effort to look at the ClimateGate emails knew that all of the climate change agenda had been effectively called into question. Now, these guys don't give up because they've been on this quest for 60 years, so they backed off a bit. Now, they've had 2 more conferences since Copenhagen, one in Cancun and one in Qatar, and they're still not back to where they thought they were in November 2009. But they're still pushing forward because as of April the 1st this year, for the first time, we have carbon taxes in this country. Australia was on point to test the implementation of carbon taxes, but we're now coming online. So it's not over. They're just taking it a little bit more slowly. So time is not on our side. I think we've got at best the remainder of this year to try to get this into the mass consciousness and get it like poll tax, so that the politicians realise and the corporations realise that this is not going to wash with the population of this country. Otherwise we have to consider alternatives. Anyway, thank you very much for sharing that with me tonight.